Well, good evening, everyone. As they like to say, can you hear me in the back? All right. Well, good evening, and my name is Will Wilkinson. I'm the moderator for tonight's panel. Everybody having a good day? All right. Good. I'm not going to do that annoying thing by saying, what? Yeah, I promised I wouldn't do it. We're going to be here tonight from 7:30 to 9:30. We've had 48 questions submitted on cards, and I've gone through them and selected some to use tonight, but all of the questions will go to the presenters. So they'll have them to look at tonight and may choose to bring them into the panel tomorrow, where we'll have more live audience participation. So tonight, your participation will be through the cards that were submitted. Tomorrow, there may be a chance for live interaction. I'll be asking each panelist one question, followed by a chance for one of the other panelists, and particularly Joel, to add to the answer from the panelist who is asked. We'll get through all 6 panelists and Joel, and then we'll see where we go from there. 2 hours, I'm not sure how far we'll go. I'm going to suggest that we explore the principle that Nassim especially was introducing of space in the form of silence, a Quaker tradition to honor the value of silence, and the meaning between the words. So I'm going to suggest that when one of the panelists receives a question, that before they respond, they wait 10 seconds. And in that 10 seconds of silence, it allows everyone in the room to digest the question. And it gives a moment for the panelist to think about his response. So I need someone out there to time the 10 seconds. Because I'm not wanting to do it. Okay, Patrick, if you can just say at the end of 10 seconds, go, then that's the word for the response to begin. Being a card-carrying Virgo, of course, I'm concerned about details, and in this case, timing. So I'm going to ask the panelists if you'll give me permission to track the timing, and if I feel one of you is being, how shall I put it, over-enthusiastic with your comment, that I could gently, but in my polite Canadian way, directly invite you to wind it up. And the way we're sitting, it's kind of impossible for them to see me, so the, I think, brilliant idea I've had, at least to me, is that at that moment, if it should come, I would raise my hand, which is a signal for you guys to raise your hands, which the panelists will see.
Oh.
No, we can't really see her.
Deferring.
And we can't see you too well, so you might need to wave or shout.
We can't see you, so please shout.
Okay.
Shut up.
Like he said. So to begin, I'd like to see how well you were listening today. And I've chosen one clue that I took from each presenter's presentation. I'm going to read it. In some cases, it's just a word or two. And I'd like you to guess who said it. All right. It's all about changing our perception. Correct. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Jennifer.
All right. That was Jennifer. Justice.
Daniel.
Mary.
Is that your final answer?
Mary.
I'll repeat the word. Justice. Mary. Obviously, there's overlap. Solutions. I'm a scientist. I don't believe in those things. I'm not looking. And the toughest question of all, space. Okay. Our first question is for John.
John has candy in his
I've got
mouth.
candy in my mouth. Yes.
John, how did you manage to protect your life from those whose interests you were revealing in your first book?
Wow. Not very well, actually. Oh,
10 seconds.
Because I believe in the power of precedent, I'll say it again. How did you manage to protect your life from those whose interests you were revealing in your first book?
not very well.
What was the question? Sorry. Couldn't resist.
Okay.
This is going to be like herding cats.
You got to account for the age of the panelists.
So, I got sued by Bechtel Corporation, Summer Institute of Linguistics, and a few others, and I had good backup papers. So when we provided those, when my publisher provided those, the lawsuits went away. But about 4.5 months after Confessions was published, I was supposed to speak at the United Nations on a Tuesday. And I flew up to New York on Monday, had lunch with this freelance journalist, and he was kind of a shady character. That night, I lost more than half the blood in my body in about 5 minutes. I was poisoned. Rushed to Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, spent 2 weeks there, had 70% of my large intestine removed. And after that, the journalist, all the information we had on him, none of it worked. So I have no actual evidence, because by the time we thought about the poisoning, it was an emergency. So the operation happened, without us giving a lot of thought to it. My 70% of my colon had been cremated. So there was never any final proof, but I'm quite sure it was poison. But I'd have to say that I don't think it was anybody very serious, like the jackals that I described, because, in a way, a book is a really good insurance policy once it's published. The last thing that the jackals would want to do is have more books sold. And even that, knowing that I was in the hospital, sold a lot of books. People thought I'd been poisoned. It sold a lot of books. I think this guy was fanatical. I don't really feel the need to protect my life a lot. And I'd just like to say that, as I said earlier today, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling upset, the worst thing you do is keep it inside. You need to take action, because internalizing it will create heart problems or cancer. Who knows what it will create? We heard about the health problems of stress earlier. So really, I think that the greatest threat to my life would be keeping that information inside me. And so publishing that book for me was very cathartic, and probably extended my life. I'm probably, Nassim, a lot older than you think I am. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, John. And good. And all of you are out there, so does any of you want to add on to John's answer? And I think we can suspend the 10-second thing for the add-on comment.
So I'll add something. I've had death threats, and I've had people say to me, "I hope your children die." And I don't know if there's a worse thing that someone can say, you know, I hope you die, or I hope your children die. And I think that for me, it's hard to put me in a box, because some people want to label me as an anti-vaccine fanatic, and other people get really upset with me because they think I'm too pro-vaccine. So I can make everybody angry in the same room. And when people do that and they attack you, and they ad hominem attack you, and they say that you don't have the credentials, and then you can add whatever. The problem is you can't really go after my credentials, because I have an Ivy League educated person. I have a PhD from Emory. I've had a Fulbright from the US government. I've been studying these issues for over 15 years. So it's hard to get after me over my credentials. So you get after me by saying, I think you're gonna, you know, I hope you die. And I want to echo what John said, is that to me is a call to action, to be louder, to talk more clearly, to keep fighting. Because you know, it's not a question of having a thin skin or a thick skin. It's a question of, what are my basic values? What do I really care about? I really care about the truth. I really care about the health of America's children. And that's who I'm fighting for. And so if people wish me dead because of it, they can keep on having those nasty thoughts, and I'm going to keep on having positive energy into the world to help our kids get healthy.
This question is for Mary. By far the most controversial comment, at least represented in the cards, was your comment about regulations. I think I have 8 cards here. And the questions were
I
like,
think we should have a regulation about how many cards you should have.
and I should need to wait 10 seconds. And, yeah. How do we take care of the environment without rules and regulations? Since the 80s, lobbying has created regulations to benefit corporations and suppress competition, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'd rather just leave it open-ended and have you respond to the widely diversified responses to your comments about regulations.
Okay. Well, tomorrow, during the deep... Okay.
We gotta do 10.
Time goes faster up here. So tomorrow at the Deep Intensive, I'm going to talk a lot more about the environment, but I'll give you a brief idea here tonight. The biggest, quote, regulation to protect the environment, what I call the pollution solution, is, of course, restitution. If I threw garbage on your lawn, you'd expect me to clean it up if I were a good neighbor. And that's what we need to do, of course. Instead of giving corporations fines when they pollute, we need to have them make it right. So that's, you know, a little flavor of what I think would be the better solution, because right now, the fines to them are just a cost of doing business. Now, there are other kinds of regulations too, which I assume are in that packet. So I'll just go ahead and very quickly address that. And that is, you know, what do we do about, like, health regulations, regulations for dentists and optometrists and electricians, things like that. And we have 50 states, of course, in the US, and this is a state regulation usually. And what they found, for example, is that states that have the most stringent licensing regulations for electricians also have the greatest number of accidental electrocutions. And the reason is, of course, the more requirements that you have for electricians, the more time people have to put in, the more money, the less likely they are to go ahead and go after an electrician's license. So there's fewer electricians, and when a poor person needs to have somebody to come in to fix his electric, he thinks, well, you know, that's gonna be a very expensive job, I'll do it myself. And of course, the problem is they get electrocuted. And that's the same for optometrists. If, you know, there's more blindness in states that have more stringent regulation, and for the same reason, and poorer dental hygiene in the states that have a lot of regulation for that. Now, the alternative to regulation, because sometimes you don't know if this healthcare provider is any good, right? You want to know. The alternative is certification by a professional organization. The difference between regulation and certification is the professional organization says, yeah, we really think this is a good qualified person, but you, as the consumer, get to make up your mind. You don't have to take their recommendation. With regulations, of course, you have no choice.
Thank you, Mary. And a comment?
I think the idea of having no regulation in a society that is so ethical that that is achievable, and we all are good stewards of our community, our nation, and our world. I do, in my professional life, I serve a role as a regulatory manager for a company that makes water treatment technology. And primarily I do this service in Canada, but also contact with various regulatory bodies in the United States. And this is specifically for technology that cleans the pollution out of stormwater runoff, which is our biggest source of water pollution in the United States. One thing that is absolutely clear is if there were no such regulations that require these technologies to treat stormwater, builders would not put these in. Contractors would not put these in. The pollution control would not be there, period. It's not even debatable. I mean, I can say that. It's sad, and it's really unfortunate, but that's the reality. I can speak to that, on a day-to-day basis just from practical experience. So I don't know how to square that up, because part of it is very idealistic, but what I see day in and day out is that it doesn't match up with the reality of how people deal economically with what is the right thing to do environmentally and what is impacting the bottom line for their business.
Can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Yes, so if the corporation had to, if they're polluting with sewage or whatever, if they had to make it right again, would they continue to pollute instead of fines and regulations?
That's a great question. I would say no, they wouldn't. And that's great. I'm glad that you provide that response. So part of it is, how do you require then that the requirement to make it good if you pollute it? Because those same selfish interests aren't going to just do that unless it's imposed on them. That's, again, another observation that I make. So, and I don't want to be circular about this, but I don't know how we get from where we are now to that ideal, and I love the ideal, and I want to be there. I want to get there like yesterday. But I think we got some more.
Yeah, since this was such a popular topic with the questions, I think we can extend this.
Yeah, this is really the creative juice of learning about the liberty perspective, because it takes time to follow each one of these questions, and that's what Mary and I have individually been doing. I thought your response was very powerful there, and in response to what you were saying, if you keep following the timeline back, so we talked about the corporations would have to make restitution. Whoever is violating, if you're dumping something in the river, then you're going to need to make restitution for everyone who's being affected by that. And so anyone downstream would be able to contact their dispute resolution organization, a private organization that has a successful reputation for integrity and non-violation themselves, and then that dispute resolution organization would go after the corporation and call them into a dispute resolution. And then the corporation would not only need to make restitution, but they would lose their insurance, because they have been now shown to be violating all the ecosystem. They've been violating all these people. They'd be out of business very quickly unless they started shaping up. So what I'm going to go into in the workshop tomorrow is that with the dispute resolution organizations, independent, with the private security and with private insurance, there ends up being swirl, a torus of integrity that gets restored by private interests that actually ends up covering everything, and nobody has the right to be outside of that system. So I don't expect people to get this right off, because it's very complex with each issue. But this is the cycle that I went through literally thousands and thousands of times, and kept realizing, oh yeah, there would be a solution to that. And you do that in environment, you do that in justice, and you do that in security and education, and you begin to see, oh, that actually works without creating the centralized control and the corruption and violence that always comes with it.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, Foster and I have discussed this at some length, as you might guess, living in Santa Cruz as we do together, that I have spent my entire life, basically almost 50 years now, litigating against the state, for the most part. I'm extremely familiar with the excesses of the state, the corruption of the state, the ability of corporations, private corporations, to corrupt the state. That's the private sector. That until such time as the corporations have been eliminated in their ability to avoid personal liability of the individuals, as I mentioned this morning. And the Libertarian Party, as we've talked about before, at one time had an actual plank, and Joe and I have discussed this before, eliminating the state sponsoring of corporations, of relieving them of that personal liability. So I think that until such time as a major step has been taken to eliminate these stockholder-owned private corporations, the corporations are a danger that has proven itself over the years to be equally dangerous as the state is. That they will in fact become corrupted. They will in fact pursue the maximization of their profit, the pushing of costs off onto the public if they can. And so even with all of the problems that I have with the state, and that's how I always refer to it, whether we're suing a state or the federal government, it's still the state writ large. And I'm very sympathetic with the desire to figure out what to do about this. But I think that the corporations, over my 50 years of practice, have demonstrated themselves to be malignantly evil. And that therefore we have to figure out some solution to getting them out of the game. I think that this idea of a kind of a private realm of these dispute resolutions, almost like it's like, I guess there would be competitive companies that provide this kind of dispute resolution. I don't know how they're going to be given their authority to enforce it. Right. Because and I've thought about this a lot. It almost always comes down, as you correctly point out, to the ultimate resort to potential force. Because I know positively, in dealing with a lot of the corporations and things that we've dealt with, if you didn't have the ultimate resort to force against them, they would never abide by these rules. So the shifting of how do you address the issue of the ultimate need to resort to force to enforce the decision made by the dispute resolution companies?
I'd like to thank you, Dan. I'd like to just reprise Jennifer's great mantra from this morning: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And we're not going to solve everything tonight, but to hold the questions and be open to the different perspectives, sign of real maturity. We've had some very large questions. I'd like to invite Nassim now to address a much simpler one that should actually be a pretty quick answer. If the Big Bang did not happen, what did happen to explain the universe?
Yeah. Way easier than politics. I can go? Well, the answer is, from my research, is that the bang is constantly happening. We're all banging. That's how babies are made, right? So this, sorry, I couldn't resist. But you can imagine, from the equations I showed today, if you calculate the amount of energy, the mass energy or the information inside a proton, you have the mass of the universe, right? So we remember that, but only a very small amount of that is expressed because it's confined by the surface that can only express a much smaller amount of information, and that's why we measure mass as this relationship of volume to surface ratio, and my equation shows that. Now, imagine, okay, so now why is the proton so stable? Like, protons are amazing things. They go for billions and billions and billions of years, like just doing their little thing, And by the way, when people tell me there's no perpetual motion or there's no free energy or all this is impossible and all this, then I challenge them to show me something, one thing in the universe that has ever stopped, right? Like that is like completely still relative to the rest of the universe, or that has disappeared. So the fact is that protons don't decay. We have never seen a proton decay ever, and that's because you have the mass of the universe in terms of energy potential outside, and you have the mass of the universe in terms of energy potential inside. So you have an exact state of equilibrium between the two. So it's in state of equilibrium. Now imagine that little proton escaping our universe. So imagine our universe, like all of a sudden, like has an exchange of what's outside with what's inside, just like the proton. And so a proton escape. Now, when it arrives in a larger universe, the density of that larger universe is much lower than the one inside our universe. So all of a sudden, the information inside that proton will inflate that proton very, very, very rapidly. And I calculated that, right? And it's exact. It's exact for the inflation, the expansion of the universe we see and the dark matter we see in the universe. So I'm able to explain dark matter and the creation of matter in the universe. So you can imagine the surface of universes foaming new universes as they lose material and as they produce material within it. So it's a continuous feedback state of creation. So it's very remarkable, and because of these equations, I'm able to calculate how many of universes like ours exist in that larger one, and how large that would be, and what's that density, and all this stuff. And it's remarkable. It all comes out right. And just to finish, before you lift your hand, it was... Yeah, so it is interesting that as this is not published yet, by the way, because I've been kind of sidetracked publishing the electron paper, but this paper I've been writing since 2012, and as I've been writing it in 2013, Einstein published a new paper. And I was like so excited, because he's been 6 foot under for a while. So, but one of his papers had been lost and was found in a file in Tel Aviv University. And it's a paper where Einstein explored a continuous creation model of the universe with no Big Bang, where the universe was losing as many protons as it was producing on the inside through the structure of the vacuum. So in this new paper I'm publishing, I'm able to cite Einstein 2013.
Great. Thank you. Does anyone else here dare add anything to that? If not, we'll move on. This question is for Danny. There were quite a number of questions relating to UFOs and alien contact coming from different directions. Regarding your UFO story and the scientists choosing not to see the lights, the fact seems to be that humans are having contact. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you know? And there were many questions relating to this topic.
Yeah. Well, I had the... Okay. Yeah, as people probably know, that the way in which I got drawn into this particular area started back in 1977 when I was at the Jesuit headquarters when Jimmy Carter became president, and he had seen what he believed to be a UFO and ended up going to immediately after his election, going to the head of the CIA to ask him to give him, as the president-elect, the information about UFOs, et cetera. And it turned out that was George H.W. Bush, who had been brought on by Jerry Ford to become the new head of the CIA after Nixon resigned. And Bush refused to give it to him. And because of that, President Carter went to the Congressional Committee on Science and Technology and asked them to get the Congressional Research Service to declassify papers to give them to the president. And I was contacted by the head of that Congressional Research Service, the Science and Technology Division, to actually get access to the records at the Vatican about this. And so I've become involved over the years, and as I mentioned, I think in my short talk, that I ended up representing Dr. John Mack. And in that context, I got to meet a lot of people. When we were preparing a grand rounds, basically, for Harvard University on the issue of extraterrestrial intelligence and the UFO phenomenon. And in preparing the expert witnesses for that, which were all going to be financed by Lawrence Rockefeller, this grand rounds, I got to meet almost the entire array of people in the world that were in positions of authority about this issue of UFOs. And after we won against Harvard University, John Mack set up the project for extraordinary research, extraordinary experience research at Harvard. And I got to sit in on a lot of the meetings of contactees. And I've had lots of opportunity to meet people who are sincerely telling stories about their contacts. So I have come to the conclusion, based on a number of things that it's too lengthy to talk about here, that it's clear to me that the Roswell event did take place, and that they actually did, in fact, recover bodies from the wreckage, that the U.S. is in possession of a craft that they've been engaged in attempting to back engineer. I have not yet been able to confirm to my satisfaction that President Eisenhower actually met with a live ET in 1954 at Edwards Air Force Base, at Muroc, at that time it was called. But I do believe that I've had a number of discussions with people who are completely sincere in their belief that they've had direct face-to-face encounters with extraterrestrial beings, and I find them to be credible to the point where I believe that I could present a case in court pursuant to all of the proper federal rules of civil procedure and convince any honest jury that this, in fact, is going on at the present time. That's sort of the standard that I would use. But I've had no direct face-to-face contact at all. I've seen the documents that I've seen in the classified portions of Project Blue Book and others, but I don't have any direct experience yet.
Well, you do now. I'm a registered alien in America.
Yeah, that's right.
As a Canadian. Panelists, anyone like to add to that? Okay, moving on for Jennifer. I feel like a game show host here. Another question that came in from a number of directions related to vaccines. Notice we're shifting around here just for, it helps actually, like a disruption of the themes, because there's so much to cover. And Jennifer, the question is, Can you make a list of which vaccines are good for us, which are not, where and when it's good to have them, and also, adding to this, what do we do when vaccines are mandatory for public schools?
The new paradigm is we have a trust in the integrity of each one of us. So I'm going to release my role to each one of you so that you will know exactly when the time to speak is.
I'm waiting for my cue. I know, but so those are two really big questions. The answer to the first one is yes and no. So the nuanced answer is that I think every family, asking the question, a list of vaccines that are good for us. Well, we understand that every human in this room is not actually human. We're walking microbial mats, right? And that we all have a different health issues and different exposures. So I don't know if that question is about asking about, children or if it's about adults. And I think that honestly, there really isn't and there shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all medicine. So I'd rather not give you an answer to that, but if you really want an answer, and you're interested in kids, I would recommend following Dr. Paul Thomas's protocol because he has, as I mentioned earlier, he's found a way to really help children be protected against the things that seem to cause the most problems if you get infections without having the chronic problems and the brain problems that we're seeing. So that entire protocol is very specific, and it's both individual and universal, and it's all laid out in the book that is here if anybody wants a copy of it, called The Vaccine Friendly Plan. So the second question is about mandates. So all of you probably, I don't know if all of you know this, but there was a law passed in California making it mandatory for children to go to school. You had to be up to date on your vaccines. And what that law did is it did away with philosophical and religious exemptions. So the way the vaccine program works in this country, and I'd actually love to hear from Mary if she has an opinion about how this should be changed, is that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention make recommendations. They do not make mandates. They make recommendations. And then each state in the United States decides how to mandate vaccines. Every state in the United States to date has a medical exemption, which means if you've had a devastating reaction to a vaccine and your doctor is willing to acknowledge that that reaction that your child had was due to the vaccine, that doctor can write you a medical exemption. And when this legislation came up in front of California, one of the biggest issues was, well, are you gonna, that the legislatures were asked is, are you gonna now go after doctors for writing medical exemptions? And the legislator said, of course not. We're not gonna make it any more difficult for doctors. That's a private conversation that doctors and their families should be having. And now that the law has been enacted since, I think it was June of this year, that's completely changed. But in Oregon, we still have, they tried to pass a law, it was SB 442, they tried to pass a law doing away with, we have philosophical and religious exemptions in the state of Oregon and medical. So vaccines are not mandated in our state. So now, do I need to answer the question of what do you do if the vaccines are mandated?
I think probably people would like to know.
So, and then there's one other situation where vaccines are sometimes mandated, which is that if you work in a hospital, if you're a nurse or a doctor, there's sometimes going to be your employer's policy is going to be that you have to do it. And in fact, another law has been passed in California. How many people actually live in California? Okay, so this is mostly relevant for you. But that now all teachers and daycare workers and any adults who are in contact with children are also supposed to be up to date on their vaccines. So I don't think that there is a place in a democratic free society for a state or a government to tell me how I should make medical decisions for my family or for myself. And thank you. That's not to say that there aren't good motives or good reasons behind it. If we can suspend for a second, if we can just suspend disbelief and really, truly try to see this from the point of view of people who want what's in the best interest of children's health, even if, so let's just say that absolutely, certain vaccines are absolutely in the best interest of children's health. We also know, as I told you this afternoon, that breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding for at least, it should be basically at least 3 months, 6 months of life exclusively, and then as long thereafter as is good for the mom and the baby, is absolutely in the best interest of a child's health. We have more than 1,000 peer-reviewed studies that show how important it is on a huge variety, both immediate and long-term, for a child's health. But does that mean that we're going to mandate breastfeeding? Does that mean that we're going to fine and penalize women if they don't breastfeed? I think it's pretty obvious that we would say that we don't have the right to tell women they have to breastfeed or we will put them in jail, which is actually done in some countries. But we can say we want to support them as much as we can. We want to make it as easy for them as they can. We want to educate them as much as we can. Okay, so Danny might disagree with me, but if there, or maybe you won't, but if there is a law that is unjust, I think that the only just thing to do is to break that law. So if you live in the state of California and you have small children, you have 3 choices. You have 4 choices. Your choice is to move to our fair state of Oregon. We welcome you with open arms. We want you here. We understand that the vaccines that we've chosen for our children work wonderfully. We have no fear of you not vaccinating your children, so bring your unvaccinated children to Oregon. Your other choice is to homeschool, which really isn't a choice in a sense, because it's basically we're saying that you have no place in our civil society unless you follow our dogmatic and not scientific, unfortunately, and not evidence-based rules. Because in the state of California, you may not go to school if you're not vaccinated against hepatitis B, but if you are hepatitis B positive, you have access to school and you can be in a classroom. So, we can't, whatever you think about, and I know there's a variety of opinions in this room about vaccines. I know that, emotions can run very high about this, but whatever you think about vaccines, that is a completely illogical thing about California. Done?
Mary, did you have anything to add since Jennifer invited you?
I think Jennifer did a great job. The only thing I would add, which is a little bit off the subject, is that one of the other things that they're doing to young children in hospitals, and they did in Texas, is took genetic material from newborns and stored it. And enough people complained that they had to destroy it. But this is something that's happening below the radar in a lot of hospitals, so just be aware.
Can I ask, what's the purpose for that?
Well, they want to do research with it eventually. But of course, if they can tie it to you as a person or your child as a person, and they find you have some gene that predisposes you to a particular disease or something, that could really be problematic from an insurance and an employment standpoint.
It's also, of course, for law enforcement, is that it's a master identifier, and that it's clearly something that should not be allowed. And I think that there are arguments that can be made if you had, hypothetically, a court system that was functioning. And by the way, Donald Trump is going to be allowed to appoint 103 federal judges that have been held up by the Republican Senate Judiciary Committee all during Obama's last 2 years. And so that we don't have a system that's functioning right now. But under the 9th Amendment of the United States Constitution, there are certain fundamental rights that have been reserved by our people. When you understand that rights are not given by the Constitution, these are natural rights that we have as human beings over and against the state and over and against the collective. And it's a great repository of important information about how we argue these cases to protect ourselves against these unjust actions on the part of the state. And you raise, when they become completely ridiculous, there's a whole other line of cases of being arbitrary and capricious and basically ridiculous, which are, and I've written a couple law review articles about those. But that this this Ninth Amendment is going to be extremely important for us if we can ever get our court system back. For those of us who are in this important dialogue about the constraint on the states and what type of private institutions can be developed by us as citizens to replace these powers that the states, federal and state governments have been taking unto themselves in the ultimate danger of some major centralized one government world, which is the basic Rockefeller agenda that we have to be careful of. So there's a lot of cross-fertilization in our ideas here that people can't categorize us in ways that people think they might. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a question for Foster. This also came from a number of directions. It's another simple one. Shrinking the Pentagon military spending, eliminating the Federal Reserve, are huge tasks that are not simple to achieve in a polarized society like ours. How do you propose we do things like this on the ground?
Well, one of the beautiful things about my research into this is it's been very humbling looking at questions like that and realizing none of us know. We don't know how we're going to get to a free society. But what I've noticed is that as education occurs, as truth emerges, people ground themselves in that truth and start getting creative around it. I mean, nobody knew, like I think Mary was mentioning earlier today, nobody knew how they were going to end slavery. The economy was going to collapse, all that stuff. But it just needed to be done. And as that ethic spread and reached critical mass, it happened, and then people figured out how to survive without, owning other people. And I think it's the same thing here. The education that's going on through the internet about the Federal Reserve and about the abuses of the Pentagon and centralized military is happening so fast. You're not going to learn about it through the mainstream, but the mainstream is no longer the mainstream. In case you haven't seen those studies, the mainstream is on the fringe now. And a quick example, I was sharing with some people over dinner that I'm in direct contact with some of the top people in this Asian Dragon Alliance. And when they originally contacted us after Thrive came out and they saw our Global Solutions Network and so forth, they got in touch with us and wanted to help us. But the first thing that they said was, congratulations on getting everything right that you said in your film. Now we're going to teach you the rest of the story. It's like, oh, okay. And we said, okay, well, what's first? And they said, well, you were right about the Federal Reserve just making up money, but they're not making it up out of nothing. They've been borrowing it from us since 1913. And I said, okay. And then as we were going on in building the relationship, and Kimberly and I we've been both very direct with them about, we don't even know if you guys are real. I know that the gold is real. I know that the alliance is real. I just don't know for sure what their intentions and capabilities are. But they said, well, we totally understand that, so we want to show you that we're real. And I said, okay, how are you going to do that? And they said, we're going to predict things that are going to be happening in the world and that we're going to be making happen, and then you'll see them happen, and that way it'll start to validate. And I said, great, so what's first? And they said, well, we're going to get rid of the Federal Reserve's ability to print money. I said, so you're telling me you're about to shut down the Federal Reserve? And he said, yeah. 2 weeks later, Ben Bernanke makes the announcement about no more quantitative easing. And they've been wanting to print money, but they were told that they couldn't. They were literally disenfranchised from that ability. And I said, well, how'd that go down? And they said, well, of course, they were really upset. They wanted to go to the World Court and declare bankruptcy. I said, what'd you say to that? And they said, well, we told them, first of all, you totally reneged on our whole deal. We were lending you the money. This was the Federal Reserve, the IMF, and the World Bank. We were lending you the money to stabilize global currencies and rescue the environment. You've done exactly the opposite with the money. You haven't paid anything back, so we're cutting you off. And now you expect us to put it on the back of the U.S. taxpayer? No way. You guys are out of business. So it could happen much faster than we can even imagine. I think that it's happened already. And I think when we go to global asset-backed currencies, which my guess is going to happen this year, then there will be no more, fiat currency will be obsolete. Nobody will want to have anything to do with it. Ultimately, I think the fractional reserve banking will go away as well. So it's happening, but it's happening beyond any plan that any one of us could create or impose on anyone else.
Mary, you had a comment to add?
Yes. Most of you are old enough to remember the Berlin Wall and remember how it came down. I don't know about you, but I never thought it was going to come down. I was really surprised when it did. And that was fast. So these things do happen. And I'm not even sure I know the whole story about how and why the Berlin Wall came down. However, it came down fast, and I think that a lot of the things we're talking about here could happen quite fast. And as Foster said, without really any planning on our part. So I'm encouraged to hear this story too.
Yeah, if we each do our own parts, then we can watch the magic arise without sitting on our couch going, well, I hope somebody else does it.
Yeah. John, there's a very relevant question which I think you're highly qualified to answer. It relates to the step-by-step process involved here. The question is, how do we transition from central banks to a real-life economy?
Yeah, that does tie in, and I think getting back to the other question, tying the two together, to realize that both the Federal Reserve and the Pentagon are basically run by big corporations. Not just that they are corporations, but they serve the interests of big corporations. And for example, the increase in Pentagon spending that Trump has just strongly recommended to put in the new budget, who does that go to benefit? Trump and his friends who own big businesses. So it's not just about, I mean, I know quite a few people in the military at high levels. Many of them are not in favor of a bigger Pentagon. It's the big corporations. It's the RANDs, it's the General Dynamics, it's the General Electrics, it's the General Motors, it's all those generals. It's the general corporations. It's not so much the generals in the military itself. And I think it's really important to understand this, and that's also the case with the Federal Reserve, that the Federal Reserve is there to support what I call a death economy. And so the real issue here on all of these things, we're talking about symptoms. You know, when I was in college, we were opposing the Vietnam War. That was a symptom. When it ended, we were all thrilled. We thought, well, we've won. We've accomplished our task. We didn't realize that it was just a symptom of a failing economy, a death economy. And then we can say the same about the Federal Reserve. We can say the same about our national budget, about the Pentagon. It's a symptom of this death economy, an economy that isn't working. And so, as I said earlier today, I really encourage all of you to go after those corporations. The marketplace is a democracy, if we will just use it as that. Every time you buy something or choose not to, you're casting a vote, which may be more important than the vote you cast in the polls, and I think it is. But you also have to send emails. It's not a question of just not buying a product from this company or buying it from that company and not buying it at all. It's letting them know. It's getting the message out. These corporations totally depend on you to buy the goods and services, to work for them, to invest in them. Many of you to manage them. Many of you work for these corporations. So if we look at all of these issues, whether it's Federal Reserve, whether it's climate change is a symptom. You know, we could go, supposedly, we can send rockets up. Somebody's talking about sending rockets up and seeding the atmosphere to get rid of the problems. That's not going to get rid of the problem. The problem is an economy that's feeding pollution, that's feeding war, that's feeding destruction, that's feeding a banking system that's based on debt. You know, the death economy is based on fear and debt to a very large degree, and that's symbolized by the Federal Reserve. So if we can recognize that the real issue here is our whole economic system, and go for that, you know, let's not make the same mistake we made at the end of the Vietnam War after all of us who participated in it went out and celebrated and got jobs. And just continued. Now we understand, and I think the new generation, as I talk in colleges and do a lot of speaking at universities and business schools and law schools, I really feel that the new generations are really understanding this, and God bless them for that. We need to encourage that, and we need to really let these corporations, who depend on all of us, to force a change in an overall global system that is consuming itself into extinction and declaring war on itself around the world. We need to get rid of this death economy and move into a life economy to really go after the cancer. You can do it.
Is there an add-on from anyone here? All right. Well, Nassim, I'm going to give you a particular challenge here. I think endemic to all these challenges we're facing is the issue of time, the sense of urgency, and is there enough time? Are we running out of time? We've even experienced that throughout today. So much to share in a certain amount of time. So the question is, how does your current understanding apply to time? Timelessness, timelines, and the possibility of multiple and converging timelines. Another simple, quick question.
I'm taking my 5 seconds. Okay, you know, as I was saying earlier today, you know, time is a concept of man, meaning it is, you know, the idea that there is linear relationship between events that eventually leads to the evolution of a system from a certain state to a new state. I was actually talking about that at the cocktail, is that, you know, that concept is not quite correct. Like if you're honest about change, for instance, if you're honest about transforms, even mathematical transforms, like you know, on a geodesic. So let me give you an idea. So if you have your hand at point A and then your hand moves to point B, you can think of an evolution in time from your hand being at point A and then being at point B, and you can calculate the velocity of that movement based on this evolution in time. Now, is that true? Well, it's only true if you were to isolate your hand and point A and point B from the rest of the universe, right? So, which you cannot do. So to actually be completely honest about what's going on, you'd have to say, well, you know, while my hand was going from point A to point B, because I'm on a planet that's spinning, I would have to add that velocity. And then it's spinning around the sun, so then I would have to add that velocity. And then the sun in the galaxy, and then the galaxy in the cluster, and then the cluster in the supercluster. And, you know, and now my hand is going at millions of miles per second, right? So it's like, wow, and then I get to the velocity of light, right? And so, like, is my hand superluminous? What is going on, right? You know, so it's problematic. So, it does, and it's related to time because it's a time that my hand takes, right? So is my hand instantaneously going to point B? And so how do you resolve that? I mean, how do you resolve your movement? It's a miracle thing. It's an amazing thing. So what is it? Where is the frame of reference? And now you gotta think really deeply. And then eventually you realize that actually what is most likely going on is that at the Planck time, which is 10 to minus 42 seconds or something along those lines. It's at very high rate of refresh. My hand is actually being undone and redone and undone and redone and undone and redone, like frames of a movie in which the frames are so rapid that it appears like a smooth motion. But actually, the universe is constantly pulsing itself into existence in each frame of Planck time, which makes it so that actually, my intent to moving my hand is actually what is registered by the field, by the Planck field, and then is recreating my hand in a Planck second a little further over that timeline, which makes me think that there's a linear evolution, but actually it's a completely nonlinear function. And so...
I knew that.
And
I think 2 pints of spit beer could resolve this.
it helps a lot. The beer can help a lot in that concept. But basically, if you can imagine now that time then is a function of the information on a specific coordinates of space. And so you can actually, using this, you can realize that eventually you can create technology that, or even in your own consciousness, that transfer information from one point to the other, right, without going through all the points in between, so that your hand is being undone here and redone over there, without being redone in all the points in between, which, if you do so, make sure you bring your body with it, because it could be very uncomfortable to have your hand over there and your body over there. But you can see that, like, wormhole, you can see that instantaneous travel and transfer of information across the universe is on these functions. And what Danny was talking about earlier, civilization that has succeeded in doing this, they've most likely succeeded at doing this because they've entered that information network of the structure of space-time and transferred the information non-linearly instead of linearly trying to go there, right?
Thank you. Now that we all understand that. All right. Well, this question is for Mary.
They're all multiple at the same time. Yeah. So multiple space-time is all the coordinates in space, each holding a frame of time, right? So,
I think we have multiple
everything is
streams going
simultaneous.
here right now, so I'm going to use my prerogative and move on to the next question. It's a challenge, and it's wonderful to have such huge questions to ponder. And again, I just encourage us to embrace the questions and not be anxious for answers. It's wonderful to live in the question. And we have no choice but to do that, really. So, Mary, the question is, how does a society provide community services, fire, police, national defense, etc., without taxation?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is you can do it usually through private organizations. Now, I have to tell you, tomorrow at my Deep Intensive, I'm going to be dealing with a national defense issue, because I know that's probably the hardest to grasp. But, like in the area I live in, garbage service is private. Water is semi-private. Our community has its own well, and, we distribute the water in that community. Some of the people, of course, in my subdivision have their own wells. They don't use the community well. So there are very many different ways to do that. And usually, when there are other options, for example, when there are 2 electric companies in the same area, that little bit of competition is enough to drive down prices quite a bit. So when you can have that competition, you usually get better quality for less. So that's the advantage of having your community services supplied by the private sector. Obviously, competition is important, because one of the things that has been happening is that government has contracted out some of these services to a private organization, but they don't always give it to the bidder who offers to supply the best quality, at the lowest price. So this is something to watch if your community is trying to privatize, not with competition, but with having your tax dollars go to another company that is, quote, hired by the government entity.
I would just like to raise a caveat here. As most of the people here are familiar with Blackwater International, that has become a private military force now. People aren't aware of that. They actually have F-15 fighter planes, battalions of tanks. And they are hired out by corporations. You know, the Shell will hire them, for example, to repress opposition to their drilling in Nigeria. They've been hired by one of their subsidiaries called Tiger Swan Security was hired by the Dakota Pipeline to coordinate the assault on the people that were there objecting to the pipeline. So the area of going into these private military companies to be hired by potential corporations, again, raises this same problem. But I hasten to point out that even when they're run by the state,
Yeah.
they serve the interests of the corporations. They just do it a little more directly. So that this Blackwater phenomenon is an extraordinarily frightening development. But as I say, that for those of us who have been familiar with it, the frightening development has been that our U.S. military has been at the disposal of these corporations ever since the robber baron era. So I think that we just need to be very careful about what gets privatized here, and that we really need to focus on keeping the state from doing the things it's doing. And if we can break this connection between the corporations and the state, as John was pointing out, I think John and I are both talking about this from different perspectives, that the elimination of these stockholder-owned corporations that are the owners of which are immunized against personal liability is a key factor that we keep coming back to over and over again as the source of many of these problems.
And if I could just add, I realized that I didn't really say anything about national defense other than I was going to talk about my deep intensive. So let me just give you a little bit of a flavor of that. You know, after 9/11, we had a lot of people stepping up to the plate without anybody telling them to volunteer blood donations, money to the American Red Cross. They volunteered for military service. At that point, our country was ready to embrace a plan by which everybody was ready to kind of participate in national defense at different levels. And that's one of the things I want to talk about tomorrow, because I think, you know, you've made some good points. And if, you know, we don't, the idea is not to turn over defense to a private company. The best way to provide defense, really, I think, is for us all to be involved in it. And maybe, you know, obviously we're all going to be doing different things. We're not all going to be soldiers. But that's something I'd like to talk about tomorrow, and also talk about the concept of military Olympics. So we get competing groups, not simply one group that we hire this out to. Because if we hire it out to one group, just as if your community privatizes your garbage pickup, for example, to one group, there's always the dangers, you know, that have been addressed here.
Well, this could go on for some time.
Yes.
But, you know, I mean, if we hadn't invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields to begin with, they wouldn't have had 9/11.
Right. And I need to talk
You know,
about
and that's the military doing that on behalf of the corporations, the oil
Right.
corporations.
Right.
So, you know, we've got to dig down deeply on these issues to solve these problems.
Yeah, I think as well.
Nassim Foster's been trying to get in
Oh,
here for a
I'm
second.
sorry.
It's really, really hard to imagine life without the state. You might be experiencing some of that, but as we look into some of these questions, Blackwater is a really good example, because when I was first introduced to the idea of private security, my head was ringing with Blackwater atrocities. But that's like, you know, only government military, then Blackwater. That's like two-level thinking. You've got to go about 7 levels with this stuff into how is it really going to work. And you can start by seeing that Blackwater has been getting paid by the state and by the corporations which are protected by the state. They're in collusion. That's the fascism that's going on right now. So it's necessary to think in terms of independent organizations. It's nicer to, I think it's easier to start with something like Uber, you know, or Bitcoin or FedEx, something like that, where there's not a whole lot of violence and scary stuff involved, and just see how those organizations, once they're freed up of the state, they're less expensive, it's better quality, more convenient, all that kind of stuff. And Uber's competing with Lyft, and it's happening now, and we all benefit from that. And but then it's challenging to move over into the area of security, because it literally, we're all wired to be very concerned about that. And we've also been taught that the state is what provides that. So imagine, if you will, for a minute, that there are multiple private security organizations in every community, and that they have to compete with each other to provide reliable service, effective service at a cost-effective price, and they are liable at any moment, not only as a business, not a corporation, not a government entity, but an independent business that has to maintain their reputation of integrity and non-violation, or they lose their insurance, they lose their business, they're out of business. And so now you've got thousands of competing security organizations all over the country. And of course, the most successful ones are going to grow as long as they're operating with integrity. And then, remember, we're not protecting, in this future society, we're not protecting the country. There is no country. There's just land that we're living on. But you've got all these security organizations, and of course the most effective ones are going to be in communication with each other, and you simply organize it so that if from the outside of this, when we're in an era where not yet, the entire world isn't on board with this freedom yet, you do have private security organizations who have all the weapons that the military has now. I would say except nuclear, because nuclear to me is violation of the non-aggression principle just in its mere presence, in the risk to everybody that it represents. But those organizations, first of all, they'll be getting bigger, but secondly, they can coordinate with each other very quickly. First of all, somebody coming in from the outside, where are they going to attack? There's no capital. You know, there's no tax base to take over. Why exactly are they coming in? And, you know, we didn't get attacked. One of the reasons the U.S. hasn't been attacked in the past is you got, 300 million armed people. So it would be very uncomfortable for someone to land on the shores around here. That would continue. You would have that kind of very advanced security, but it would all be based on non-violation rather than centralized power.
And John, you had a comment?
Yeah, with all due respect, I'm not sure that it makes a lot more sense for me to pay. I'm not quite sure I understand the difference between paying taxes to the government and paying private companies, except I will say that in the prison system in this country, which has gone so much to private, we've seen horrible abuses.
Right.
We've seen the prison system get much, much worse with private. And I think there's a big difference between garbage collection and fighting fires, or police, people who have to be trained extensively. If you've got a bunch of companies out there that are all trying to train police to be up to the snuff that our current police is up to, or the fire departments, they're competing with each other. It seems to me like there's a waste of resources there, and in any case, I'm going to end up paying for it. What am I going to do? When my house is on fire, I negotiate with a company to come and, I'm not quite sure how that system works, but I still end up paying the money, and it seems as though I'm also paying for a lot of people to be trained to compete with each other, and I just throw that out. I certainly don't know the system well, but I have watched in the prison system. I think it's abhorrent what's happened there with privatization.
But so do I. But it's not. It's like you've written about what we've got now is not capitalism. It's corporate cronyism, it's corporatism, all of that kind of stuff. So it's really important to get the vocabulary clear, and right now the private prisons are atrocious, and if they were held accountable for their violations, then they would be out of business very quickly. But they're within a system where, and Catherine Austin Fitts has really laid this out, they're in a system where the collusion between the state and these private corporations allows them to get away with those abuses. Mm-hmm. So think of FedEx. Are you paying to have all these people compete because there's DHL, there's all sorts of other organizations? You're simply paying to get the least expensive good product. And I think that's what the free market does, if it's really free, not combined with the state.
Yeah, but Federal Express and its competitors, this is on a big global market. I live on an island with 25,000 people. I've got a police force and a fire department. If there were 5 of them there that were all competing with each other, I don't think any one of them would be nearly as efficient as the ones that I've got right now. I mean, I haven't thought this through.
Well, can I address that for you?
I just wanted to make a comment. I lived in many countries in the world, and one of them being Canada, and we've got a few Canucks on the panel. And I've experienced the medical system in the U.S. and the medical system in many other countries. And certainly, I'm terrified to be brought to a hospital in the U.S. Like that alone will kill me before whatever I've got. More than, and I assure you that I don't feel that way when I'm in Canada, and I've experienced the medical system in Canada quite a bit, or in France, or in England, or in Switzerland. And there's benefits out there of, the U.S. is one of the only Western country that doesn't have, public, healthcare system, and that, and it rates at 3 times the cost of any other country, and it's rated at 37, I believe, on the world, quality of care. And so, the privatization of the healthcare system in the United States has not been successful, as far as I can tell.
Well, if I could address some of the concerns. First of all, about the police, the private police. I actually lived in a town that had private police, and what happens usually with the private police is they want to make money, obviously, and the way they make money is not to let crime happen. They prevent crime, and the way they do that is they train the people that they're, accountable to, a city or whoever's hired them, in better techniques to discourage criminals. Because, of course, if they have to go and hunt somebody down, that's much more expensive than just preventing the crime. It also has cost a lot less. And in cities that have employed the private police, sometimes the police unions, the public police unions have come in and driven them out, and then the cities are paying 3 to 5 times more for service that does not include this preventative component, which of course most citizens prefer. So there is a system in place that does work with private police. Also, our medical system, it's one of the most highly regulated industries in our country. So it's not a free market at all. And in my new book, Death by Regulation, I calculate that 80 to 90% of the costs that you pay for drugs at the pharmacy, for example, are due to regulations that hurt us instead of help us. So, this is true across the entire medical system, which is really sad because it really, of course, results in problems, basically a shorter life for all of us. So I thought I'd share that with you as well.
I don't understand that comment.
Yeah, I would like to say that I think this is a complete ideation that you're suffering from here. This idea of this abstract concept of all this privatization and stuff like that is so completely unrealistic. And again, pointing out all of my critiques of the state, the idea of having competing military forces just seems to me to logically run to having a whole bunch of private armies hired by different groups to protect themselves, and they're all fighting with each other. I fear centralization, as you both do, and I think that steps need to be taken against that. I tend to think that this fact that none of this has been done before, even though Ayn Rand had that town in Colorado where they all tried to figure out all this stuff before, that I just think this is an ideation, and I don't want anybody to get the impression that this is a new paradigm, because this is not my idea of a new paradigm. at all.
Well, if I could just-
As much as I like both of you, and Foster, you and I have been talking about this a long time, I figure we've got to figure out how to have the collective community be able to make collective decisions, and limit the violations of the state, et cetera. But a collective community needs to be able to make decisions to protect ourselves and to protect our rights. And I don't believe private groups are going to do it. I just want to be on record about that.
Well, there have been many studies showing that these things do work in the real world. There's over 1,000 references in my book, Healing Our World. And I know I had to dig them out because I had the same concerns, right? You know, if it doesn't work in the real world, why bother with it? And what I found is just about everything has been tried before in different societies at one time or another and has worked. So, you know, that's what I'll be talking about partly again tomorrow. But I think the question that keeps coming up, and I think it's a good one, is that we have such a skewed system today with corporations and the way they're controlling government. I mean, we have to break that chain. I think we all agree with that. It's just how do we do it, and how, so that we can actually get to a place where we can have the kind of solutions and the kind of cooperation and everything that we want to see. So
There's just that one thing that keeps happening is that how do you ultimately enforce the decisions of these arbitration and mediation private companies when they're defied by them? You hire your private army to go beat them up?
actually,
How do you do it?
Well, actually, we had a good example when the West was settled. You know, back when the West was settled,
When the West wasn't settled, the West was taken away from the Native American people.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
I agree with you. I agree with that. But
Fuck them taking
me-
away the West.
yeah,
You know?
well, well, there was a good system in place to address your concerns, because what happened is when the migration happened to the West, there was no police there, there were no roads, there was no government there for a long time because the states didn't become states for a long time, right?
That's because other people lived there.
Right, but I'm just
You
letting.
know? They lived there for 1,000 years and
yes,
were doing
I
fine.
I don't argue that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to address this court system that you were concerned about. So what they did is, before they even went out west, they made contracts with the group they went with, and they said how their disputes were going to be settled, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, as more people came, there were conflicts between the different groups of settlers. And what they did is they worked it out with this arbitration. There was no, there wasn't actually much problem in terms of the courts. The courts that they had set up for themselves actually worked pretty well with the other courts to make things uniform. There's a really great article
was a lot
about
of
this that
gunfire.
you
Yeah,
can.
they had a lot of.
Everybody was packing.
Well, no,
took care of the
there's
problems,
actually a great article called "The Not So Wild Wild West."
I'm sorry, I did not come here for a political back and forth discussion. We're not talking about a change of forms, we're talking about a change of consciousness. Let's talk about that.
Okay.
I'd like to just expand this a little bit. As you notice, we've moved just from questions from you that are represented on cards to different panelists into more of a conversation between the panelists, which I think is very healthy. And I think there's a good evidence of sensitivity here. I'd like to expand this conversation. I know there's some comments down on this end. Nassim, you had one a while ago. Your question may have been answered by now, I don't know.
No, not really. I just feel like, you know, I think at the end of the day, there's got to be, and this is not my field of expertise, so I don't mean to interrupt anything in that, and I generally just thinking about these problems, but I think there's got to be a good balance between local communities taking decisions at the local community level, and actually, you know, having local interactions that are regulating their region and that are interacting in such a way. And there's got to be a good relationship between that and regulatory systems that make sure that corporations cannot run amok. because, you know, the example of the pipe dumping stuff down the stream, and the people down the stream, you know, going back to the corporation asking them to make it right. Well, first of all, in order for the people down the stream to know that something is wrong, there's got to be some kind of scientific agency or some kind of people somewhere making measurement, making sure that, you know, like all this is, like, Joel, you work in that field, you know what I mean,
Yeah,
right? You're going to know that it's happening.
And that type of monitoring is rare.
Right.
People think it happens a lot more than it actually does, in fact. It's rare, it's costly, and people are blissfully unaware
Of what goes
how
on.
fast things degrade.
Right, exactly. So how you have to have some kind of structure that allows that to inform the population of what's going on, and hopefully, anyway, to me, you know, there's got to be a relationship between the regional organizations and governmental structures and the corporation. And I think it should be brought back to the regional organization and not be so centralized. I agree with that, but I think there's still got to be some kind of government or governing structure that allows that to happen.
Yeah, would a bioregion, you know, there's a lot of discussion in the new consciousness, the new paradigm of bioregionalism, so that there's kind of an organic community that is around a particular kind of body of water in an ecosystem,
watershed management.
ecosystem, et cetera. And would you guys be open to having a kind of a localized governmental structure so that the collective community can make some common rules, and if in fact there ultimately has to be some sort of enforceability, so that it's not just completely voluntary, what kind of enforceability would you guys be willing to authorize?
Well, there's a book by Eleanor Ostrom called Managing the Commons, and she won a Nobel Prize for that book. And she really looked into exactly this issue. And she studied with various farming things, fisheries, basically, where there's the environmental gray zone of fish or birds or whatever are moving through a region. So it's challenging. And what she found was that, that having distant corporations didn't work, having centralized power in a government didn't work. What happened was voluntary organizations of the local people with vested interests. So of the fishermen who knew that they needed a sustainable flow of fish coming through every year. So it wasn't government, but it was an organization making effective decisions locally. And in terms of enforcement, for me, the key will always be to have independent organizations, both organizationally and individually, liable for initiating any violence. And independent security organizations, to me, are going to protect those types of situations way better than some centralized police, because now you're bringing in the government, and they've got powers that you and I don't have.
I'm interested in addressing a question to Jennifer. I'm just aware, balance-wise, you haven't had quite as much time. This was a question that was posed to the entire panel, but if you're willing to take it on, it's an interesting one. Do you think maybe we ought to drop the R from revolution, which implies revolving, such as a revolving door, and use the term evolution instead?
Can we hear from the audience? Because there's some people here saying enthusiastically yes, and I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Revolution just brings you right back to where you were before. That's the point.
So the comment there was revolution brings you back to where you were before, so what's the point?
If it's a spiral, you're not coming back to the same point. And revolution creates a certain amount of centrifugal force there, momentum.
If it's a spiral, you don't return to where you began, but to another point. I'm repeating these questions for the sake of those looking on video later. Down here, yeah.
Isn't it about where we assign the power of vitality? When we talk about a healthcare system, we're placing the power of our vitality outside of ourselves.
So it's a question about vitality and where we place authority.
I love what John talked about with perception. It's about perception. It's about finding the magic of the consciousness of who we are.
It's about perception, finding the magic of who we are. I'd like to give it back to Jennifer, just since you initiated this, and let you comment in return.
Well, it's interesting because I love hearing all of these comments and thinking about these ideas, and then I get stuck a little bit on the word evolution, like replacing I appreciate everything that people said in the audience, and then I'm not sure I want to place. I think the term evolution is an interesting one that needs to be understood better and kind of unpacked. So I'm not sure we replace revolution with evolution unless we really make a much more profound understanding of what evolution is.
If the comments from the crowd can be brief so I can repeat them for the video, folks, yeah.
Society is always in motion, either revolution, counter-revolution, evolution, or counter-evolution.
Society is always in motion.
So if we're headed toward wholeness, it depends on how much opposition there is to get to that, whether it's revolutionary or evolutionary. It's a matter of speed of change.
If we're headed to wholeness, it depends on which speed we're going at.
So
If we can just carry on a little bit more focused here. So
no, I mean, just speaking to that, there's a Darwinian notion of evolution that is about survival of the fittest and, competition and, natural selection. And I don't think that that is a really accurate understanding of how life has evolved on Earth and how humans have evolved. And earlier we were talking about how we coexist with our biome and our microbiome, and actually symbiosis is a much stronger and more compelling argument about evolution. So we actually, you all knew this because everybody in this room knew that mitochondria used to be free-living organisms. That's the endosymbiotic hypothesis. And I think if we understand that we live on a symbiotic planet, we live a symbiotic life, and maybe that goes back to some of the concepts that you were bringing up, that then we can really find a way to get to wholeness.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to make one comment.
go ahead, Foster.
Regarding revolution, I would invite you to ask yourself, throughout history, what has revolution always been against? And what's it's always replaced by? Yeah, I mean, in recent history, it's the state. Before then, it was the kings, and then it was the pharaohs, and whatever. But it was always somebody ruling us. And of course we'd eventually revolt against that. But it's always replaced by the next regime of rulers. So I would just leave you with a phrase that's an important one to me, which is, it's not just the abuse of power that's the problem. It's the power to abuse.
Well, yeah, but revolution is also the industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution, the revolution of ideas, consciousness revolution, which is what we're going through now. I think it's not always about overthrowing, or it is about change. To me, revolution is about change. And you're talking about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but I really believe we're in an incredible revolution right now of consciousness, which will help us evolve. So I think this revolution can bring about an evolution. If we can move through a revolution of consciousness to rise to a higher level of consciousness, we evolve into a different species, a more evolved species, a more conscious species, a species that's really awake to its symbiotic relationship to the earth. Because other than the indigenous people who I spent a lot of time with, who still have a symbiotic relationship, we've pretty much lost ours. As the civilized people or the industrialized people, the death economy is not symbiotic for the most part. And so part of our revolution is to understand that we need to change that. We need to revolve out of an old consciousness, a death economy, into a new evolution, which is a higher state of consciousness and will take us to a system that truly serves us and the planet, that's truly a renewable resource in and of itself, and that's symbiotic.
Yeah, I think there's an element. Yeah, I think that's great, and I think there's an element as well that's missing in the conversation when we think about these things, because it's easy to miss that element because it's an element of the future that's emerging, and that future is a future in which technological developments are going to make a leap. a literal quantum leap in its capacity to transform our society. That is, we're on the verge of gravity control. We've changed our society from a very rudimentary society to a fairly advanced technological society in about 150 years of understanding how to control electromagnetic fields due to, you know, theories such as Maxwell's theories and Faraday's that taught us how to use electricity and magnetic fields and so on. And we've built a whole society on that. And there's a jump, there's another jump that's about to happen. And that jump is to understand and learn to control gravitational fields. And that will change everything we know about structures on our society, in our society. That is, when you're no longer confined to the surface of this planet, you know, it's a whole different ball game. Like when you're going to orbit Jupiter for the weekend, you don't really care what the legislation is saying back on, you know, or vaccines, or yeah. And so you know, things are about to change dramatically. I'm not kidding about it. And it's important to put that in the balance of the equation of this transformation, this amazing evolution, this amazing quantum jump, where when we extract energy from the structure of space-time, and I've shown you today there's more in the centimeter cube of space than all the stars in the universe. You know, the idea of a lack of energy, the idea that we have to war for energy, the idea that we have to war for land or for, you know, that whole thing goes away. Like, as society changed dramatically from simple, we're talking two simple fundamental developments in technology that are about to happen on this planet.
We will be, thank you. We'll be continuing with another panel tomorrow, so I know there's a lot of questions out there, and we're nearing the last 15 minutes of today, so I'm sorry that we can't accommodate everyone in the audience. That wasn't the intention of this panel. That's for tomorrow. I'd like to give the opportunity for every panelist just to make a closing comment. We'll need to be brief to fit it into 15 minutes, but maybe, Danny, we could start with you and just come down the line.
Sure. I think that what appears to be a conflict here is actually an exploration of attempting to try to figure out how we as a species can get past this stage that we're in. It's been going for quite some time in our development, of the kind of reposing of authority in some minority that can repress our people, and that the business model that's been developed, as I've pointed out repeatedly, of this corporation has got to be overcome. We've got to get rid of that, and they're going to fight back. I mean, they are using this to maintain this incredible control, and they've created the state in a certain sense to continue that power. So that I think that this discussion that we're having here is a very important one, of how we can get ourselves free. And I think, Nassim, your point is extraordinarily important about the revolutionary implications of some of the technology that's coming along now, and this issue of the discovery of the exoplanets that I started our conversation this morning about. That I think, of almost all things, is going to have such a massive impact upon us that all the major institutions, the churches, the state, the economic system, are all trying to get ready to try to figure out what to do about that. Mm-hmm. And I think if we can assert our own control over that process, rather than allowing the state or the corporations to gain control over our relationship with the extraterrestrial civilization, I think that's going to be one of the most important new paradigm aspects of anything that we can possibly do here in this conference.
Wow.
I would just add that one of the reasons that we're here thinking about a new paradigm and thinking about elevating our consciousness is so that we can be prepared for these changes. And it's very important, I think, for us to discuss these different ideas because obviously there's going to be a lot of give and take and a lot of understanding that we're going to need to have to cope with the change. So not everyone agrees, and that's healthy right now because that's what we need to do is explore. We have to ask the tough questions like Danny's been doing. And, you know, then if those conflict with the beliefs that others of us have, we need to look and see if there are solutions to that. And so that this is a very healthy dynamic of disagreement sometimes. It's not always comfortable, unfortunately, but it has to happen so that we can finally get to the place where we have the resolution. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to echo that this is like a dream come true for me to be in this conversation with everybody in the room because as you probably know, this is not what's happening out there in the world. There's such artificial certainty, such polarity, such literally hatred and fear going on amongst really good people. And so one of the best things we can do in architecting a new paradigm is present a model of respectful, I love your word of exploration, because none of us have all the answers to this. But this room full of smart, caring people who are actually looking for the truth in a harmonious way through this. So I look forward to all of us being able to dive in deeper into this engagement tomorrow. And I just invite you in sleeping on this overnight to ask yourself whether or not there's some level of inconsistency in yourself that you're willing to settle for. Last year at the ANP, my wife gave a talk which moved me and many people really deeply, and it was about passionate intent and unconflicted behavior. And it's something that Kimberly and I talk about a lot, and we're dedicated to getting the conflicted behavior out of our lives. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so committed to exploring this whole liberty possibility, is because first of all, just having to let my money be taken by people that I don't trust anyway doesn't feel good. And then the things that I watch them doing with it, and then the corporate personhood and these violations of the environment and so forth, I'm unwilling to continue living with that inconsistency. I'm relatively patient with the process of transition, but I'm dedicated to freeing myself and our humanity from those contradictions. So I invite you just to ask you, what internal contradictions do you have going on, and what do you see as a possible way beyond them? We can look into that tomorrow.
Well, my observation has been a lot looking out at our audience here most of the day, and thinking about some of the things that are common themes about the corporatocracy, how distorted it is, and it's done a lot of damage in its current embodiment. And what is the most coveted constituency that corporations desire? What age group? 18 to 35. Generally, that's what you always hear. That's the most coveted age group. How many of those are here? How many are here that are 18 to 35? Less than 1%, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. My point in bringing this up is that so much of the problem that I observe on our planet socially is how fathers teach their sons. All right? And that those instructions, that tradition is something that oftentimes is very wholesome and wonderful, and it sustains us in many ways. But in other cases, it's something that perpetuates these cycles of distortion and destruction and death. And we can't always count on fathers to provide the right counsel. So somehow we have to figure out more effective ways to reach out to that constituency that is coveted, and is the leadership coming up, And I am suggesting that somehow we got to reach out to those young men who otherwise have the propensity to continue the degradation that they've been taught, because it's generally, I think, not the women out there creating the wars and who are the ones who are in these high councils making high economic decisions. I don't know, Danny, if it was you or John, but it was the room full of white men, okay? And probably very few women, and probably very few of other races as well. So somehow we got to figure out how to change this demographic, because I think there's a big demographic gap here. The other thing I wanted to mention was, there are other societies that have gone through this adolescence that we're going through on planet Earth right now. They exist. Danny mentions exoplanets and all the projections right now that we're dealing with hundreds of billions of likely inhabited planets out there. And science is saying that's a fact. It's a statistical probability now. And I would tell you that a book I've been studying for now going on 2 decades, that was material from the 20s and 30s, says, oh yeah, well there's 7 trillion inhabited planets, and for every inhabited planet, inhabited meaning that there is human level or higher life on that planet, for every one of those there's 1,000 other planets that have some form of life. Okay, so now you're into the quadrillions. All right, and they speak of high ethical conduct and how other planets have had to go through this very, very troubling and dangerous adolescent period. So there is information out there. I tell you, I would love to go into every Catholic church, because I have been raised Catholic, I still have deep Catholic sensibilities about it, and I know that Catholic Church gets very maligned, and I think most maligned by estranged Catholics who are disgusted with some of the shortfalls there. And I know. Anyway, I would love to open some minds there. Okay, I'll just leave that. Thank you.
So, that's a tough one to follow. I'd like to invite you to take a very, very brief shamanic journey, and I think we're going to go to one of these planets that Nassim, I don't know, so that I think there's like 10 to the power of 392 planets that might have life. I don't remember how many he said, but
it's large.
It's large.
Yes.
So we're on one of those planets, and we've learned how to defy gravity. And so we've also learned how to do this, go to point A to point B without actually doing it. We just do it. And so we've done that, and we're now hovering over this planet. So imagine yourself. You're in this craft, or it's not even a craft. It's a state of consciousness is what it is. It's a vibratory dream, but you're there. And you're looking down on the planet Earth. And you're trying to decide whether to connect with these people down there or not.
You're listening to CNN.
and Fox. And you're watching how these people who've been given their stewardship of this planet are killing each other and destroying the planet. You're looking down at all of this, and presumably you've come with benign intent, or maybe good intent. You're smart, you're conscious, you're evolved, because you've been able to do this after all. And so you're looking down. Would you land? I think what I would do, and I think most of us would do, is say, hey, let's watch for a while and see what these people are going to do with themselves. So my challenge to you tonight here is to let's assume that they are out there, they're watching us, and let's, in our generation, even before the 18 to 36-year-olds get their shot, let's us give these people good reason to come and make love with us.
John and I were having a little disagreement before the mics went on. And I said I didn't want to drink out of a plastic cup because it was destroying the environment. And he said, yeah, but look at what you're drinking out of. Do you know where that steel is made from? Well, aluminum. I said, no, I think it's stainless steel. But do you know how the people in China are treated who are in those factories? And, you know, I'm glad you're all laughing. We have a lot of questions and we have a lot of problems to solve. And I think we have a responsibility to have every single one of these conversations and to figure out really viable solutions to the problems and to find our power as people and as a society, because we really want to ensure that our planet continues and that we're always, not always, but you know, there was a time that McDonald's didn't exist, and there will be a time in the future when there is no more McDonald's. You know, life oozes into all sorts of interesting places and it takes all sorts of interesting forms. And I happen to really like humans. I love the invitation to come over and make love. I mean, I just think that human beings are, you know, fascinating and complicated and difficult and interesting. And I don't want to see the end of humanity and humans. And so I think we have a responsibility to keep having these conversations because we want to have a future for our children. That's all.
I'm imagining all sorts of interesting appendages. Okay, so this, I think I really, actually, I typically have an aversion to panels, I must admit. Just because in general, you know, I found them in some cases not to be very productive. I really think that the conversation we had tonight was very significant for me personally, myself, just because I can see the opening of something fantastic, you know, of something incredible occurring, because I see the balance and the interaction and what may appear like confrontation, a possibility, you know, of something new emerging and something very powerful new emerging. I really want to take this last moment to talk a bit about that this revolution or this evolution that's happening is an evolution in our capacity to love ourselves enough to allow the transformation to occur in each one of us. And it's something, I don't know about you guys, that I struggle with every day. And that, you know, has to do with, like, you know, feeling that connection with the universe, feeling the support, feeling that we're not kind of alone. And I think, you know, to talk about what we, you know, Danny and others were talking about, it's like we're not alone. And not only are we not alone, like there's a whole universe of Plancks going, go, go, right? And that has like created this amazing coherency, this amazing miracle of 100 trillion cell of you made of 100 trillion atoms, like all cheering you on, right? And if I can remember that miracle every day, if I can just remember that miracle, even if it's just a few minutes in a day, my life is completely transformed. And the life of the people around me is transformed because I'm not so aggro, you know. and that makes a big difference. And so if we can make that difference, like at that level of localize, you know, then the invitation, you know, I in the vibratory ship up there, they go, oh, look at this guy. Oh, you know, the gratitude for the miracle in every moment that I am alive, you know, it's like, wow. When I feel that, that's when I'm inspired. And if I'm inspired and you're inspired and we're all inspired together, we're gonna make this change.
Yeah. Well, I know we're all very, thank you. I know we're all very grateful to be part of this conversation tonight. It's been exceedingly honest, intelligent, heartfelt, and I'd like to leave us tonight with a question that came in. We didn't have time to get to it, but I think this is where we have come to. And we would like to leave you with this to ponder as you leave tonight, have a good sleep, and prepare to return tomorrow to continue. Question was, why is homelessness an epidemic in the U.S.? And I think tonight we've had a nurturing experience of being at home with each other, with divergent views. We didn't need to all agree on every point. It was a feeling of brotherhood, fellowship, love. It's heartbreaking, the epidemic of homelessness, where humans feel like aliens on our own planet. So as we leave this space tonight, let's just feel deep in our hearts the possibility of extending this kind of conversation, with words or without, to everyone that we're with. And take that out as our mandate tonight. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.
Well, that was cool.